Well, hello, everyone. This is Kevin Gilmore, Executive Director of Nazarene Benefits USA. I want to thank you and welcome you to this Treasures Workshop, virtual workshop, where we're going to cover what NBUSA does in terms of benefits for our pastors and talk a lot about our retirement plan and the Minister's Match program as we end the session. But we trust you'll find this informative, and I'd like to open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your love and grace in our lives. I give you thanks for every participant in this program today, whatever their role in the church is. Lord, I pray that you bless them. Your word says if we lack knowledge, we just need to ask you for it and you'll give it to us. And so we do that this morning. I ask for wisdom for those of us who are presenting and wisdom for those who are listening and partaking, that there'll be information here that is relevant, that is important, and that they will take action on as they hear it. Bless our time together. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. So as we begin today, I'm going to have a disclaimer as everything we share with you today. We at NBUSA, we're not licensed financial or tax advisors or attorneys. But we've made every effort to make sure that the information that we're presenting is reliable. It's come from reliable sources. But as always, we encourage church leaders and treasurers to be responsible to consult with your own locally qualified professionals as you consider applying this information to your situation. We're going to ask a few quiz questions as we go along today, so please help us by participating in those. This first question is really just to try to get a baseline on who is attending this session today. What is your ministry role? Are you the treasurer of the local church? Are you one of the local church ministers, a district minister, or some other role? Please respond to the poll so we can get a kind of feel for who is participating today. So we'll give you just a moment to do that. Wow, 74% are treasurers, so that's wonderful. Looks like about 13% local church ministers, 3% district, and 11% other. Wonderful. Well, we're so glad you're all joining us today. To begin with, let's start with a very high-level overview of what it is we do at NBUSA. If you're not familiar with us, we're the benefits arm for the Church of the Nazarene in the United States. We only serve ministers in the U.S. And this pie chart that you're seeing here is a representation of the approximate amount of time and effort that we spend in different areas of the benefits that we provide. And if you'll look at the right-hand side of this chart, you'll see it's all retirement-related benefits, with most of that being our 403B plan for active ministers today, our legacy pension plans. And then we get on the left-hand side and we get into the insurance benefits, survivor insurance, which is the word we now use for life insurance, and long-term disability insurance. We provide a base level of those. Educational programming like this webinar that we're doing today, the materials that we produce, the information on our website. And then a small portion of our overall time is spent in the benevolence area, which is not a big portion of our time or money in our budget, but it's those times when we help respond with some financial aid to ministers in times of need. And it's a very impactful part of what we do for them and what's going on in their lives. I think all of us, whether we're working for the church or elsewhere, have experienced working for a non-church employer. And when you think of benefits to employees of a non-church employer, the structure looks basically like this. You have a single employer that's the sponsor of the benefit plans. You have a common human resources department who administrates those benefits to all the employees who participate in them. In the church world, and particularly in our Nazarene world, it looks quite a bit different. Looks a whole lot more complex because it really is. I don't think there's a human resource department in any of the thousands of churches that participate in our plan, but we are still responsible to communicate benefits and to administrate benefits to all of the church entity employees, which are mostly the ministers, the pastors. And so this is why I'd like to stress in this presentation how important it is when we communicate with you treasurers, how critical it is to make sure you pay attention to that information and share that information with the participants in your particular area of responsibility. We're funded through the Funding the Mission formula. We are 2% of the 10% that the local churches pay in. And before we go any further, we want to say thank you, local churches and ministers, for making sure that you make your connectional budget contributions on our behalf, because this is the lifeblood from which we operate and provide benefits, and we are very grateful. How do we use those funds that you provide to us? If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see this is an average from fiscal year 15 to 23. Our fiscal year ends on September 30th. And you can see historically over those years, we spent 2/3 of our budget on the legacy pension plans. And if you recall our history, going back to the Great Recession in 08 and 09, our pension plan became significantly underfunded. And we had to make a lot of efforts in the intervening years where most of our resources were used to shore up that legacy plan for our pensioners. Contrast that to this past fiscal year that ended September of 24, you can see we've gone to dropping the pension resources down to 44%, and we've doubled the amount that we're applying to the 403B plan. And the reason we are able to do that is because of all the efforts in these prior years have stabilized the old legacy pension plan, where we don't have to contribute nearly as many of our resources to it in order to meet its pension obligations out into the future. And so then we're able to shift those resources to active ministers, and you'll hear more about how we've done that later on in this presentation. The benefits that we provide, it's important to remember, are always intended to supplement, not replace, not to be the sole source of the benefits for local church ministers. So whether we're talking about insurance, retirement, or benevolence, we're here to help. We're not here to be the main source of those benefits. Second quiz question. The IRS allows a local church the option to treat a minister as an employee or an independent contractor. Is that true or is that false? And the survey says, oh, we got a split group here. About half the group says it's true and half the group says it's false. Well, let's talk about that for a minute then, shall we? I'm going to talk about ministers' compensation and the tax responsibilities for local churches. And so as we go through these next series of slides, you're going to see us refer to memos. This is memo number 12. We have 13 memos that we've published. They're available on our website. They cover a variety of topics. This one covers the subject of who is a minister for tax purposes, and that's where we're going to begin this conversation about who qualifies as a minister for tax purposes, because you'll see that ministers have a very unique tax status. So in the Nazarene world, we comply with this by saying that the minister must be ordained or district licensed. So it doesn't apply to local church ministers in terms of the benefits that we provide. And they have to perform key religious functions like sacraments, preaching, church leadership, etc. And the dual tax status that we refer to is right here related to employees. They're considered an employee for federal income tax purposes, which means ministers under the IRS code are exempt from income tax withholding if they so choose. But they're considered self-employed for Social Security tax purposes, meaning they have to make estimated tax payments under the Self-Employment Compensation Act. So that's a very unique tax status for ministers in the U.S. But here's the answer to that quiz question. Ministers are employees. They're not independent contractors. Pastors should receive a Form W-2, not a Form 1099, whether they're full or they're part-time. So if you have a minister that's performing those services, they need to be getting a W-2. And if you're using a 1099, we would ask you to consult with your local tax advisor who's knowledgeable in this area to make sure you're doing it correctly. Because churches are considered employers for ministers. There's a common misunderstanding among a lot of our churches that ministers are fully self-employed, and that's why they do the 1099. But the reality is that ministers are considered an employee for income tax purposes, and they're considered self-employed only for Social Security and Medicare purposes, and they have to pay their own self-employment tax, which means the minister is responsible to pay both the employee and the employer's portion. When in the secular world or in a non-minister employee, the employer pays half and the employee pays the other half. So the minister is an employee of the church if the church does the following: exercises control over what work is performed, directs how that work is to be done, requires regular office hours or attendance at meetings, sets a salary or regular paycheck level, pays employment-related benefits, or provides a housing allowance or parsonage, supplies tools and equipment. This is not an exhaustive list of everything that would qualify a minister as an employee, but it's an example, and it's all about facts and circumstances. And the IRS's perspective is a minister is an employee unless you can prove they're not. And that's a very difficult thing to do in most cases. So the IRS considers ministers to be common law employees. You can see memo number 2 here. Church employees or independent contractors goes in a lot more detail on this issue, and I would encourage you to pull that resource down and read it if you'd like more information. But it's also based on the guidance from IRS publication 517, and denominational policy supports what we're talking about in this area. So what's at stake if a church misclassifies a minister as a contractor instead of an employee? Well, there's the potential for IRS penalties and interest. There's back taxes that could be owed by the church, and then those taxes and penalties applied. There's loss of housing allowance exclusion for ministers, and there's a potential for disqualification from retirement of our benefit programs. So there's a lot at stake to make certain that you get this right. And if you know anything about the Internal Revenue Service and how they operate, you can go a long time being out of compliance and they don't say anything. And then something happens and you get audited, or there's some type of inquiry or letter of clarification, and then the whole thing becomes a problem. So it's very important that you meet with your local advisors to determine the classification of your ministers appropriately. Let's talk about strategies for structuring a minister's compensation, which is our memo number 4. Things like base salary, housing or parsonage allowance, what employer paid or reimbursed benefits are going to be involved. What's the level of retirement contributions that the church will be involved in helping support for the minister? And then the important area of reimbursed ministry expenses. You want to make sure that if you're reimbursing your ministers for their business expenses of the ministry, that you're doing it under an accountable plan. Because if you're not, then that is considered income to the minister. Housing allowance is a crucial benefit for ministers and clergy in the U.S. It's one of those things that they have great advantage of that most other Americans do not. And our first memo number 1, talks about housing for your pastor and whether you have a parsonage situation or housing allowance. Let me just say, if you're in a situation where you provide a parsonage to your pastor, one of the things you need to think about is if you're doing that, they don't, and that's all that you're paying for them, you might want to consider contributing something to their 403B or their retirement accounts. They don't get to benefit from the increase in valuation of owning a home if they're living in your parsonage. So that's one of the things that's a disadvantage for them in that matter for retirement. But we know housing allowance has to be designated in writing before the payments are made. You can't do it retroactive. You have to do it before. It needs to be approved by the board. It is excludable from income tax if it's solely used for housing expenses. And we'll talk about what those expenses are in a moment. It is still subject to self-employment tax. So even though they don't pay federal income taxes on that amount, they still have to pay their Social Security taxes on it. And it's not includable in box 1 of the W-2. And you can optionally put the information about the housing allowance in box 14 as a matter of information if you choose. And then memo number 3 talks about those tax and reporting procedures. Again, box 1 is just the taxable wages, excluding the housing allowance. Box 14 is where you can report that housing allowance amount as an informational item only. If the minister is an employee of your church, there should be no Social Security or Medicare wages shown. There should be no Social Security or Medicare withholding shown on the W-2 because they're supposed to be doing that on their own. They're self-employed, remember, for Social Security and Medicare purposes. And then I said earlier, their federal income tax is optional for withholding. And what most ministers do, and we encourage ministers to do, is to figure out their tax situation, fill out a W-4 with their church employer and say, please provide optional federal income tax withholding enough to cover their federal tax and their Social Security and Medicare self-employment tax as well. I mentioned earlier about the accountable expense reimbursement plan, and that's something we talk about in memo number 5 about minimizing income taxes for church employees. And some basic requirements of that accountable expense reimbursement plan is it has to have a business purpose on the expenditure. There needs to be timely substantiation of the expenditure. You can't wait till the end of the year and reimburse for everything for the year. If you give an allowance of funds, there has to be a return of excess funds, such as if you give an advance for a trip or something like that. There needs to be a return of the excess funds in an allowable, reasonable time frame. And if you follow those rules, and there's a lot more information to share there, it will not be included in the minister's taxable income if those rules are followed. By the way, I didn't mention at the start of our session, if you have a question about any of this information, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom software. Emily Bartlett and Roger Creedon, two of my colleagues here at NBUSA, are monitoring the questions that come in. And if a relevant question comes in for the middle of the discussion, Emily will interrupt us and we'll ask the question and answer the question. And then the rest we'll try to deal with at the end of the presentation. Excuse me. Memo number 7 talks about financially caring for the minister. And so when it comes to retirement contributions for ministers, our 403B plan allows the minister to make contributions that are tax deferred, just like anybody can withhold funds from their paycheck into their retirement account. And then minister salary deferrals are allowed up to a limit. There are IRS limits that apply to everybody, and we'll talk about those in a later slide. That's usually not an issue for a Nazarene minister because they're pretty high, but they do exist. And retirement benefits from our 403B plan. So when the minister hits retirement and begins to make distributions from the 403B plan, or if they're in our old legacy pension plan, those benefits qualify by policy as housing allowance. So if you think about it, a minister can contribute to the 403B plan. The church can contribute to the 403B plan on his or her behalf. It can accumulate earnings over the course of their active service. Then when they retire, the minister can begin to take distributions, and if they do it in amounts that qualify for housing, remember, subject to those limits, because it's just not an unlimited amount they can do. But there's a way to properly plan. They could receive and take out and earn all of their retirement funds on an income tax-free basis. That's a tremendous advantage for our ministers. So some key takeaways from this part of the presentation is that ministers are employees for income tax purposes. We should not issue a 1099 to an employee minister. Make sure housing allowance is designated in advance, and be sure that you, the church treasurer, church board, and the minister all completely understand and document the different forms of compensation so there's no questions about how things need to be treated, and you've taken all of the necessary steps to minimize the tax impact on the minister.
Hey, Kevin, I'm sorry, before you move on, we have a few housing allowance questions. Can I run those by you? Yeah. Okay. So one question I've seen a couple times is when does housing allowance need to be done or redone? Does it need to be signed every year? Is it at the start of employment and never again? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Thank you, Emily, for asking it. So the housing allowance, the IRS doesn't really prescribe that, but we would recommend that it's looked at every year. If you just make it part of your year-end processes, that's the simplest way, because then you can account for any changes that have taken place. However, I know there's guidance from the ECFA, that's the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, who say they actually, I believe, have a form in their materials where the agreement, the written document about the housing allowance actually has a clause that says this runs in perpetuity until it's changed by agreement of the parties. And I believe they believe that's acceptable. I think it is fine, but I think you're better off looking at it every year just to be sure everybody's fresh on the numbers. Your housing costs should be going up every year. They don't typically go down. So it seems like you'd want to make an adjustment at least every year, but I hope that helps answer the question.
And one person also wanted to clarify, when you talk about housing allowance, is that including a parsonage, or is it just monetary allowance, or a combination of both?
Yeah. So if you're in the situation where you have a parsonage being provided to you, that value of that parsonage rental plus any furnishings that are provided is excluded from your income. So there's two ways to do it. One is you exclude the value of parsonage that you're using because you don't pay anything for it. It's being provided as a benefit of the church. The other part is if you're paying your own housing expenses. And so it applies both ways. Great questions. You'll see on the screen, we have the 13 memos that I referred to earlier, along with a QR code that will take you to them on our website. These are all available for you to download. I encourage you to download for resource and as well as share with your pastors. We didn't cover every one of them here, but those are the ones that are there. And I will tell you, we periodically update these memos, and the last time we updated these was about a year ago, and we had an external independent CPA look through them to make sure we weren't saying anything tax-wise that has changed or that they would say is no longer correct. And so we're not just creating these on our own, we're also having some professionals look over them as we publish them. All right, our third quiz questions. If the local board is the local board required to have an annual audit of the church's finances? Ooh, that's another good question. And the answer is 70% say yes. And the 70% who say yes are correct. But let's talk about that a little further. Thank you for responding to that poll. So, accounting records and good stewardship are things that we think go hand in hand. And so the local church is a trustee of the funds that it receives from its members, its congregants. So you want to be sure to handle them carefully. Financial reports need to be meaningful and prepared timely. I believe the manual talks about monthly reports. You want to make sure that you're accounting for all funds, not just what you're using for operations, if you've got a building fund or other types of reserve funds. But the answer to the previous question is yes, an annual audit is required. But let's talk about that a little further. It doesn't necessarily mean you need an external independent CPA to come in and audit. While that would be ideal, it's usually not an affordable option for most of our churches because it's very expensive to do that. The manual says there's a minimum requirement. There has to be at least it has to be done at least internally by an audit committee of the church. You know, you could say your finance committee, or maybe you appoint a special committee for this purpose to determine the validity of the financial statements. And so there has to be some level of financial oversight documented every year that would satisfy this audit requirement. You know, financial integrity is important. You want to trust the treasurer. As treasurer, you want to be trusted that you're doing right, but you also want some things verified beyond you to protect you and also make sure the board is living up to its responsibility. We have in memo number 8, which I just shared a moment ago, we talk about church internal audit guidelines in there, so you're free to use that as a resource. And if you want to know some specific reference of what's in the manual, go to section 139, paragraphs 21 to 23, talk about this part. I mentioned the ECFA a moment ago, and there's a couple of really valuable resources. If you're not familiar with them, I would encourage you to either go to the ECFA website and download them. We provide them as a resource on our website. First is the Minister's Tax and Financial Guide. If you're a treasurer, you should have a copy of that for you. I would encourage you to share it, one copy with your pastor or your ministers. And then as a church, the Church and Nonprofit Tax and Financial Guide is another very valuable free resource that just helps you navigate the tax reporting and all the things that are important about how you handle ministers' compensation, as well as a number of other tax factors. So I encourage you to get those resources. Let's move into how we provide benefits from NBUSA. And that always begins, remember I showed you the picture of how our organization is structured for the benefit programs. There's thousands of churches that are participating employers in our plan. So you can imagine we don't have a common payroll system. We don't know what ministers are exactly paid. We don't see any of that information. So there's a lot that we have to administrate that's unknown to us. And that's why it's important that you understand what your job and your role is as treasurer when it comes to our benefit plans. So rather than try to qualify people at all different times of the year as they come in and out of church employment, we have set up a process to simplify it. So every January 1st is our cutoff. And on January 1 of every year, we look at these things. We look at credentials. Our database is tied to the General Secretary's database. So if you change information with the Gen Sex office, it will matriculate to our database so we can see what a minister's credential status is as of January 1. We also look at what the ministerial role of the participant is on that same date, and then what level of NBUSA fund support has been paid by that local church minister's church. Our benefits apply to local church ministers. That would be any senior pastor, whether they're full or part-time, whether they're bivocational or not, and then any associate pastor who meets the full-time, full livelihood requirements. Those benefits apply if the church contributes at least $1 to the NBUSA fund. I don't believe we have any churches that contribute just $1. Most of them do something more substantial, but it's important to make sure that something is happening. And so your status and your benefit coverage is determined on January 1, and it remains that way for the rest of the calendar year. And the only exception that could change that is somehow the ministers lost their credential or let their credentials lapse. All right, quiz question number 4. NBUSA provided life and disability benefits provide all the necessary coverage for the average local church minister. So you get our benefits, you don't need anything else. Is that true or false? And the survey says that is false. Very good. 94%. That is exactly the right answer. While we wish it was enough, it is not. And so let's talk about life insurance for just a moment. The two most important, there's a lot of different reasons and financial strategies that life insurance can be used for in a person's life, but for our purposes, where we have a group plan and their term policies, the most important factors that are there for ministers in our church is it's for income replacement. And I would say the second bullet point here is the most important. It helps to pay off debts and cover expenses should a minister pass. I've highlighted the $15,000 coverage level in this slide because this is the base amount we provided for many years up until a couple of years ago. And we changed it because we recognized that more of our younger ministers, those up 50 and younger, needed more than just 15,000. It was one of the things we were doing to try to improve benefits for our local pastors. So we changed that. We doubled it from 15 to 30 and added this at the under 50 and under level. But we also had more and more of our ministers who are working past the age of 70, which we didn't used to have any coverage. So we added a 71 to 75 level of $7,500. After 75, there's no more coverage for active service ministers. And then there's a spousal component. If your spouse predeceases a minister, there's a $2,500 benefit for the minister. According to the current IRS regulations, life insurance proceeds are not considered taxable income to the recipient. And those of you who answered that question know, so many of you understand, this is not enough insurance. This is just a very simple base level for the average Nazarene minister. So we have supplemental insurance that's provided by the Hartford that ministers can purchase up to $500,000, or churches can purchase for the ministers. And I would encourage you as treasurers to look into that because it's a relatively inexpensive benefit that can make a huge impact on a minister's family. And spouses can purchase up to $125,000. And if spouse purchase supplemental insurance, then the dependent children are covered at 50% of that level up to $20,000 at no additional cost. So you can get the spouse covered and get the kids covered for free up to $20,000. I mentioned that we provide this as supplemental insurance through the Hartford, and we have a guide on our website called Nazarene Supplemental Insurance Guide that covers the supplemental additional insurance that's available for purchase for group term life, the long-term disability, and then we have an accidental death and dismemberment option as well. Here's the table from that pamphlet that talks about the survivor benefits, the life insurance. It's based on whatever your age is as of January 1. Again, that January 1 is an important date for our operation. You might turn the different age the next day, but whatever you were at January 1 is the age that's used. and you can buy in increments of 10,000 up to $500,000. And I show at the bottom, if let's say a church wanted to cover their pastor for 250,000, so the pastor would have the 30,000 from our base coverage that we provide, and then another 250 through this supplement. If the pastor is age 30, it would cost $240 a year to provide $250,000 of coverage. And you see the cost of that goes up as the pastors get older, which is very natural for a life insurance product. So I would encourage you, church treasurers, don't just take our word for it about how these are affordable pricing for you, and we'd love to have them part of our plan, but check these costs and this coverage against what you can get locally in your community. And maybe you can find it cheaper, but this, we have a really strong collective buying power in the church with thousands of ministers participating. And as you can see, once you hit age 60, the amount of coverage available starts to drop. So it goes from another 500,000 down to a max of 100,000. When you hit 65, it drops to a max of 30, and it goes on down from there. So obviously the life insurance companies minimizing their risk as we get older. If you have a minister serving your church who is moving into retirement, there is a retired minister benefit, life insurance benefits based on their years of service. You can see after 31 plus years of service, it's a $6,000 benefit. If they're a part of our legacy pension plan, what we call grandfathered status, if they were part of the pension plan prior to 1996, their benefit could be higher than this depending on what their pension amount is. And if that is higher, that's what they'll get. This is just the minimum that they'll get in retirement, or in retirement as a life insurance benefit. Our long-term disability policy is a base level, $500 per month should a minister become disabled. There's no waiting period. The payments start 3 months after disability. When we say there's no waiting period, you can be covered from day one. A minister can be covered from day one. The benefit doesn't start until 3 months after the disability has been determined. There are pre-existing condition limits. If you have concerns about that, please contact our office and we'll connect you with the right folks to discuss that. And the church or the minister have the ability to purchase additional coverage up to $1,500 a month in value. And one of the important things about this disability insurance is if should that happen, that situation occur, that benefit can be received as part of the housing allowance as well, so they can avoid taxation. Here's from that supplemental pamphlet, the table of benefit available from up to $1,500 and what the annual cost is based on age. And you can look at that and make a determination for yourself whether you think that's an affordable benefit option or not. Supplemental accidental death and dismemberment insurance is not something we provide a base level of, but it is an optional insurance program that church ministers and their spouses or dependents can purchase up to $200,000 of additional coverage for the minister, up to $100,000 for dependents, and that policy is underwritten just like the long-term disability plan is. We often get asked if we have a health insurance plan. If you've been around the church long enough, you will know that we did at some point a number of years ago before I joined this team. We do not have a plan that is nationwide for our churches, but when we're asked a question, we direct those who ask to look at the Guidestone. Guidestone is the benefits arm of our friends at the Southern Baptist Convention, and we partner with them to offer an option of health insurance coverage for local churches. They will write a policy down to a single employee minister. So if you are interested, if nothing else, if you have a plan in place locally, you might contact Guidestone when your renewal period is approaching to see if they offer a better option. The most important thing about utilizing Guidestone as your partner is that they offer faith-based medical coverage that's uniquely designed for your ministry. If you're buying from Blue Cross Blue Shield and all the others, your faith perspective doesn't mean anything to them. So you might want to be sure to check this out. We adopted a new vision statement a few years ago that said Nazarene ministers retire well. Retiring well means different things to different people. There's not one common definition, but we think it means being able to retire well when the minister wants to and with the resources they need to live the lifestyle that they are used to and have chosen. Quiz question number 5. The majority of currently active local church ministers or their churches are contributing to the minister's Nazarene 403B retirement savings plan account. The majority of our ministers or their churches are contributing to that minister's 403B retirement account in the Church of the Nazarene. And the survey says that is false. 59% say that is false. And you who say false are true. And I'll talk about that here in just a second. So why are so many struggling with retirement readiness? Over 70% of our ministers are not contributing, or their churches are not contributing to our retirement plan. You know, one of the reasons, you may have a startup, you may have a church that the bivocational minister who doesn't receive any compensation. We know there's all those kinds of reasons, but there's a large chunk of our ministers who need to contribute to the plan and they're not. And one of the reasons we think that is because they think it looks like this, that it looks really complicated. And so we created the Ministers Match program effective January of 2024 to show that it is not complicated. It's extremely important that ministers get active and their local churches support them. And so we created this program. So the first year ended in December. We did our fourth quarter 24 match in January. And the results from that first year of the program were that 24% of our otherwise eligible ministers received a match. There were 34% of our local church ministers who did everything they needed to do to realize something from this benefit, except neither they nor their local church were contributing to the retirement account. If they would just contribute to the account, they would receive a matching benefit from us. That's all they have to do. And our focus over the next year or two is on that 34% to try to get those ministers and those churches activated. There's not a reason we can't make this happen in 2025, and we need to make sure we help these ministers in preparing for retirement. The average local Nazarene church pastor needs retirement resources from three places. The first is their own level of active savings, what they put away themselves. The next area is their Nazarene benefits. That's what you at the local church help provide that minister for their as contributions to their plan, to their account. And then what we provide through matching contributions. And the last leg of this three-legged stool is Social Security benefits. And I've got the Social Security website address listed there. And if you need treasurers, you need to encourage your pastors to occasionally check the Social Security website to make sure that the earnings history that they show agrees with their own personal records. But it takes all three of these things for the average Nazarene minister to come close to retiring well. Clergy in the United States have some unique tax advantages. The first one being the housing allowance we've already discussed. So there's a portion of their pay designated as housing allowance in advance that they don't pay federal income taxes on it. Now they still have to pay Social Security, Medicare through the self-employment tax, but they don't have to pay federal income tax and usually no state income tax in most states. The next thing is the contributions that the minister they themselves make to the 403B plan. Is the income tax on that is deferred until they take it out in retirement. And ministers have a secondary advantage here is that they don't have to pay Social Security and Medicare taxes on whatever they contribute out of their paycheck to the 403B plan. The average American outside of a minister doesn't have that. They still have to pay Social Security taxes. While those assets are in the plan, in their account, and they're earning, accumulating growth, accumulating income, the taxes on those are deferred until distribution. So when it comes time for that minister to retire and they begin to distribute out of the 403B plan, Fidelity will provide them with a 1099 that says the taxable amount is not determined. And that's because our policy and our operating statement is that those retirement benefits are eligible for housing allowance and retirement. It's all subject to all the same terms and conditions as when you're active service, with one additional change. And that's down here at the bottom of this slide. You no longer have to have your annual housing amount approved by the local church board because you're retired. The minister's retired. They're not amenable to a board. They don't even have to get it from the district. As long as the value that they claim for housing is the lesser of their actual expenses or the fair market lease value of the home and its furnishings, as long as that criteria is met, then they can claim it as housing allowance. A very important financial advantage for ministers in the U.S. Whenever we make presentations, we go to PalCons, General Assembly, other places, M25. We have a lot of people approach us and say, I just don't know how much I should save for retirement. What's the give us the magic number. The reality is there isn't a magic number. Everybody's situation is different, but this graphic came from our partners at Fidelity, who is the record keeper for our 403B plan. And they have put this together based on a financial strategy that most financial planners would give to anyone who asked. And you can see what they've got along here is whatever age you are at, there's a multiple they would consider you should have in your retirement based on what you're earning, your gross earnings is at that age. So age 30, a minister, let's say they're making $40,000 a year just for a number. Well, they should have 1 times that in retirement by age 30. And you take it all the way out to age 67, which is normal retirement age. You should have 10 times whatever your gross earnings. Say this minister is making $50,000 a year at their age 67, getting ready to retire. They should have $500,000 in retirement. Now, when I present this information to a lot of our pastors, they look at that and say, man, there's no way that that's even possible. And I would challenge them to come back and say, well, if this isn't possible, you need to come up with a plan that is. Maybe that's not your number, 500,000. You need to figure out what number is and what's your path to get there. This is just one suggestion. The second question that we get after how much should you save for retirement is how should a minister save for retirement? And again, we'll refer to the guidance of our friends at Fidelity Investments. The first thing they state is that beginning at age 25 or by no later than age 25, a minister should be putting 15% of their annual gross income away every year into retirement. Now, that's not 15% of just their pay. It's the equivalent of 15% of their pay, but it's what they put away, what you, the local church, help contribute for them. Maybe you do it through a match or just a discretionary contribution. And then what we put in at NBUSA through the Minister's Match Program. The combination of those 3 sources should be 15% of a minister's annual gross income. Point number 2 is that the investments in the minister's account should be mostly invested in stocks at an early age, and then you get progressively less risk and get more conservative in the investment strategy over the course of time. But on average, it should be 50% or more in stocks over the course of your active service. The stocks is where the greater risk is, but stocks is also where the greater return is. And when you've got 40 years ahead of you, 30 years ahead of you, you've got time to ride the ups and the downs of the market. If you're 60 looking to retire at 65, you don't have that kind of risk to take. You should plan to retire at age 67, but you should plan to live to age 93. Life expectancy somewhere in the early 80s today for most people in the US. But the important thing to remember here is that's the average. Half the group is going to live longer than that. You don't want to run out of assets in retirement. So Fidelity's advice is plan to retire at normal retirement age, but plan to live to age 93 and have the resources to do that. Then plan to maintain your lifestyle and be sure to identify anything in your lifestyle is going to change that could have an impact on costs. We know that medical expenses get more expensive in retirement. So think about those things, and then you should review your strategy annually and then make adjustments as necessary. Let's talk about the ways that ministers should manage their money in retirement. There's 3 choices. They can self-manage it if they feel like they have the competence to understand how their funds are performing, how they're allocated, how to reallocate, and all those kinds of things. Fidelity allows them to do that. If they just want to keep it simple and just invest in a single fund, which we'll refer to as a target date fund, they can do that as well. And we have options for that. The third option is have a managed account where Fidelity, for a fee, will manage the account plus whatever other assets they have. Maybe they have a spouse that has a retirement account. Fidelity will help manage those for a fee, or you can hire a third-party certified financial planner who also will charge a fee, typically asset-based, percentage of your assets. If a minister wants to do the single funds, that I don't want to complicate it, I want to keep it simple. Here's an example of what that looks like as of last July. These are the target date funds. So every 5 years, there's a fund that's out there that's professionally managed on a daily basis. So if a minister was 25 years old today, joining the church, serving as a minister, if they did not direct us otherwise, and we were going to match some of their local contributions, or you as an employer were going to contribute, we would put their funds in this 2065 fund, because you can see it's 90% invested in stocks, only 10% invested in fixed income. And as you get closer to or getting older, you'll see the progression, how it gets less invested in stocks over time, more invested in fixed income, safer, focusing on income instead of value. And that's how those single target date funds work. And after a while, this one here will drop off into this fixed income, this income fund, and we'll add a 2070 fund out here in the near future. So that's the single fund approach. And here's what Fidelity, if you're interested in having Fidelity manage your funds for you, the red circle there is showing you what their target is to charge based on the size of your portfolio. For most of our ministers, it would be this first 100,000 at 50 basis points, their annual fee to be the advisor for you. A little bit more about our plan. It's a contribution plan. So it's defined by what goes into it in contributions. It's not based on years of service. It's not a pension plan where there's a formula and a fixed payment. We have an over $800 million portfolio of value in the 403B plan today, over 13,000 accounts. Money gets into the 403B plan in only a limited number of ways. A minister can't write a check and send it to Fidelity and say, put that in my 403B account. It's an employer-sponsored plan, so the funds have to come through the employer. So the minister can have withholding from their paycheck, and then the local church can also contribute. That's what we call local effort. And then NBUSA matches local effort in our match program. And those are the ways that contributions get into the minister's account. We have an investment committee that provides oversight. It's the General Church's investment committee that meets quarterly and looks at the funds in the plan and evaluates whether or not they're performing to benchmark, what the costs are. And they're advised by an independent financial advisor who doesn't have skin in the game. They're not, what they get paid, it's not based on how the funds perform. And if you're not aware, we have a board of directors. We have a wonderful group of 11 people that serve NBUSA. It's a mix of lay persons and ministers. Our bylaws require we have at least 4 members of our board be ministers in the church. We have 2 that are here by virtue of their positions. That's Dr. Busick today as our jurisdictional general superintendent in the U.S., and Keith Cox as our general treasurer. Quiz number 6, the fund and operating expenses of the Nazarene 403B plan are on par with other similar plans. And the survey says true. All right. For those that you think that's true, hang on. We have a very low cost and expense structure. So that orange line across the top of this chart, that's the average for plans similar to ours. This is us down here. This is actually a study that was done by an independent advisor that was given to us in 2019 based on 2018 data. So the average plan across the U.S. is paying over 2% a year in all of these costs and fees. Our plan is at under 50 basis points. And last June, it was 33 basis points, so $3.34 per thousand. So we have a very low cost expense structure in the 403B plan, which is to the advantage of all of our participants. Fidelity Investments is our record keeper. They provide lots of planning tools and services on their website. You can go to a local branch office for direct support if you want to get face-to-face in person with someone. They offer a diverse array of mutual funds. We have 27 funds in our plan. We added a Roth component a few years ago to allow after-tax contributions. Only the employee can do that. The employers can't. NBUSA cannot. You might think, well, why is that important if a minister can get it in housing allowance after they retire? It's important because when the minister passes away, the housing allowance goes into the grave with them. It doesn't get inherited by a spouse or kids. So you might want to have them consider creating a portion of their retirement into Roth so that when it's inherited by their beneficiaries, they can get the tax-free treatment when they distribute it. We offered a brokerage link option a couple of years ago there as well. It offers a way for people who don't like the choice of our 27 funds to say, I want to go get something else. It opens the universe of the mutual and index funds that are out there. You can get CDs and treasuries, which have been really important in recent years because of the high rates you can get. But you can't buy individual securities. They're getting charged retail fees and fund costs. So those low cost fund things that I just shared with you don't apply to anybody who uses the brokerage option. It's like a retail account. And there is no oversight by the investment committee. We're not monitoring performance on the brokerage side if someone chooses to use that. I think it's important for people that are listening to understand what's been the performance of our 403B plan over the years. And if you look what I've circled here, we earned nearly 23% in fiscal year 24. It was kind of hard not to earn 20% in fiscal year 24. It was just one of those years that was really good. But the 5-year running average was almost 10%. This is for active and retired participants. You know, the retired participant should be a little more conservative. And then over here, if you look at the 10-year average, it's almost 8%, 7.74. So the fund choices that we offer are meaningful. You can see over the course of time, it's gone up, it's gone down, but you'll see in a moment that 7% is an area that we're saying people should use to plan for retirement. What does the Church of the Nazarene manual say under the calling of a pastor? It says that providing the agreed upon remuneration in full is considered a moral obligation by the church. And further, under the local church board section, it says that it needs to include retirement benefits. So the message I want to give to you treasurers is that just paying your NBUSA fund allocation is not enough. We have too many of our ministers that are not prepared for retirement, and it's a bomb going to go off in our denomination if we don't address it. And so the church needs to come alongside and help the pastor. We'll talk about how to do that. So how do we address this lack of retirement readiness among our ministers? We studied that for a couple of years and came down to this conclusion. There has to be more local effort on the part of the pastor and the church, the local church, and there needs to be more from NBUSA. And so we created the Ministers Match Program, and I'm going to walk through a very quick example of what this looks like. Let's say we have a church who's paid 100% of its connectional budget to us, and they have a lead senior or senior pastor. So according to this chart, if they've paid 100%, we'll match 50% of whatever the local effort is by the church and or the minister, up to $2,500 from NBUSA. So let's walk through what this example is. The minister put $2,400 away in a year. The local church said, hey, pastor, we want to help, so we're going to match 50% of whatever you do. So they put $1,200 in. One of the changes we made to this plan after we started it was we allowed student debt payments on the part of the minister's student loans, not their kids' loans, not their spouse's loan, their loans for their education. Whatever the level of those payments were, we would call that local effort. So the total of those three numbers add up to $5,000 of local effort for this local church minister. And so we're going to match 50% of that. So that's the $2,500. They hit the max. So if you add up the orange colored numbers there, this minister is going to have $6,100 contributed to their retirement account in this 1 year. So how does that look like what happened last year? These are the results from last year's program. You can see in 23, we had 1,200 ministers and or their churches were contributing to a minister's account. That grew by 54% through the fourth quarter, a tremendous response, but there's still more to do. We averaged $600 under our old APS program that we contributed to a minister's account. Last year, that grew by 184% to over $1,700, thanks to local matching efforts. And so here's what all those numbers look like put together. By the end of the year, the average Nazarene minister, that 24% I showed you in the previous chart, had almost $5,800 contributed to their retirement account. If every minister did that, at this 5766 level, you break it down into quarterly installments, you earn 7% making contributions on the front end. After 25 years, this local church minister would have $390,000 in their retirement account. If they did it for 35 years, they'd be up to nearly 900,000. It'd be well over $1 million if they did it for 40 years. So it's a reachable goal. These are good numbers. It can happen if more local churches and ministers would get active. When we announced this program, I received lots of calls and messages from ministers saying, this is not affordable. My church is too small. We don't have any extra money. And I said, well, what else are you going to do? You know, retirement's coming for all of us, whether we're planning for it or not. So I said, what else are you going to do that you can get an instant 61% return on? So if you put $1,240 in your retirement, you're going to get $750 from us. That's a 61% return. Here's how that could happen. If a minister contributed $125 a month into their retirement account, it would only cost them $1,240 because there's a tax benefit for doing that. They'll reduce their taxes. but they'd end up with $2,250 in their account. They're $1,500 plus $750 from us if their church contributed 100% to the NBUSA fund. We matched at 50%. That's if you did that every year for 40 years, and you earned a 7%, which I just showed you, our plan is earning more than that, you would have nearly $500,000. Notice in the example that I just showed you, there weren't any local church contributions. It was just the minister. If the local church helped, say they did a 50% or 100% match, it just, you can see how it would exponentially improve those numbers. And the local church can help out the local minister in a couple of ways. You can make discretionary contributions. Let's say you wait till the end of every year and you do it in one lump sum. Or you can do your own level of local matching. You can tell the pastor, we're going to match a percentage. We're going to match a percentage up to a max. We're going to do X amount. You can do it any number or combination of ways you want, but coming alongside the local church minister to help incentivize them to do something on their own is important. Our matching contributions from NBUSA are done every quarter. So after a calendar quarter ends, we go through a process of pulling information from the Fidelity database, and then we do the matching from there. So the money is getting into accounts on a quarterly basis so it can grow. If you're getting matched on your student loans, those have to be registered with us through the Fidelity website. Those can only be matched one time per year. It's just a constraint of the servicer that we're using to track student loan payments. So this is what I ask ministers who I present this to when I get to this point. After hearing all of this, what's your plan? Because the most important step that they take is the next one. And I encourage ministers to start small. Everybody thinks they can't afford it, but if you start small and continue to make annual increases, it'll get to a point where you won't even notice it. I've highlighted this talk with your treasurer or board. I've become convinced in this, I'm on my 6th year of service in this role, there's not enough conversation going on between church treasurers and their ministers about what the minister is doing for retirement. That conversation is uncomfortable, especially for the minister, but it needs to happen. I've been a church treasurer. I've been a church board member. I would be sick if I didn't think my pastor was getting what he or she needed to secure a retirement that was meaningful. If the pastor's bivocational, they need to consider what they're getting from their other vocation and consider it all and take advantage of both or the best. And if they've struggled to this point, haven't done what they needed to do, my encouragement is to forget the past, but focus on the future, because that's the only thing you can help change. But please don't wait. So to maximize a minister's benefits from us, they need to maintain their credential and their eligible role. The church needs to make certain that their NBUSA fund budget is paid 100% because that provides the maximum level of match. Make sure there's local effort. I mentioned 34% of our otherwise eligible pastors didn't get a match last year, didn't get a benefit from us for retirement because neither they nor their church contributed. Register student loans if they have them. Evaluate need for additional insurance. Check the earnings history with Social Security, and then just evaluate the planning status at least one time per year. Because an adequate retirement is about time and money. The more that you have of one, the less you're going to need of the other. That's an axiom that is proven true every year. This is the slide that shows the limits on contributions to a 403B plan. You can see for 25, the regular limit is $23,500 for the employee. I'd have yet to meet a local church minister who contributes $23,500 to their retirement every year, but I would love to meet them. If you're over age 50, there's a catch-up provision you can use for a total of $31,000. And the total of this plus what the employer does is maxed at $70,000. And if you've got a pastor who's bivocational, it's $70,000 for what you're doing for the Nazarene plan plus any other plan they're in. And then if you're age 60 to 63, there were some changes in the law that actually increased this catch-up provision. I won't go into those, but just you need to know they exist. If you have a situation where you have a minister serving your church who doesn't receive cash compensation, let's say they receive a parsonage as their compensation, there's a quirk in the IRS regulations that says a church can contribute $10,000 per year, or a minister can have $10,000 per year contributed to their retirement, even if they didn't get a paycheck. But there's a $40,000 limit lifetime for that minister from any church that they serve total. So it's not a lot in the big picture, but it might be something you should consider. These are ways to contact Fidelity. You can reach them 8:30 to 8 p.m. Eastern time through this 866 Nazarene number. This is the number. If you call, it will take you to what they call their tax exempt market. That's those who deal with church plans and other tax exempt plans. You can meet one-on-one with a Fidelity advisor, and you can do that also at a local Fidelity retail office. Although I would caution, local Fidelity retail offices aren't always familiar with the intricacies of a tax-exempt plan. Our office is available Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30 p.m. Central Time. You can call us, you can email us, you can visit our website. Remember, we are not licensed advisors. We encourage everyone to consult their own financial advisors. If you go to our website and you click on the drop down over there that shows if you're a church treasurer, you can click here. It'll take you to a bundle of resources that are related to your role in the church. Over here, if you click on the benefit login, it will take you to what we call the My NBUSA portal. This is a portal for participants in our plan where they can see the details of their benefits with us. This is not for church treasurers. I want to make sure you see this note. If you're trying to use this to make contributions to the 403B plan, there's a separate program called Fidelity's Simplified Contribution Plan, SKIP. That's the place that you do that. You do not do it through My NBUSA. Compass Initiative is reaching the end of the grant program they have for a minister's financial education and grant funds. They're now taking names on a standby basis for that. We're trying to find ways to partner with Compass Initiative in the future for other ways to financially benefit and our ministers. So more to come on that later. This is the last question of the presentation, and then I'll close out with an example of something on the retirement plan. I must hire a financial planner to determine the best plan to retire well. True or false? And the survey says that's false. Wow, very interesting. Well, I would tell you it is not a requirement that you have to do that. We would strongly encourage participants to hire a financial planner because we think there's a lot of wisdom in that, even though there is a cost. But we do have some tools that we'd like to provide to help for those who want to try to do it on their own. Again, we're not creating a formal financial plan, but we've created a tool which we're happy to share with you for 9 simple inputs from the minister that will help to identify the potential value of their 403B plan benefits in retirement, and it also quantifies the high cost of waiting if they don't take action. So I've got a pre-filled example I want to run through quickly, and then we'll be open for questions. This is a minister who's age 35. They plan to retire when they're 67. That's full retirement age for normal retirement age for Social Security purposes. They want to make 7% on their invested assets while they're working. Remember, that's a very reasonable, conservative number for the long haul. The current balance in this minister's 403B account is $10,000. So we put that factor in. And this is the hardest question in the whole grid is what do they want that balance to be? And so for the sake of discussion, we just put 500,000 in here and said that's what they think they're going to need when they reach age 67. The next 4 items is how long do they plan to live? Remember, we said use 93. You know, Fidelity is telling young people today they should put 100 in these planning tools. What kind of return do they want on their funds when they're in retirement? Get a little more conservative, so we drop that to 5%. Then how much do they want to take out of their assets each year once they reach retirement? 5% is a pretty normal number, so we'll start there. And then lastly, you know, inflation doesn't stop when you hit retirement. It's still there. And so we put an inflation factor in here so that this, whatever amount they take goes up by 3% every year so they can stay ahead of costs. And this is what all that does. All those numbers I just shared with you, they're going to have 32 years until retirement. That $10,000 they had in their 403B account today will grow to almost $100,000. So the difference between that and the 500 they want to get to is $406,000. That's how much they have to come up with over the next 32 years. The good part about that is they only have to come up with a little over 100,000 to get there. And they can do that at $283 a month. And I'll show you what that looks like. But if they are successful in reaching this goal, they're going to start retirement getting $2,000 a month from the 403B plan. And when they reach age 92, it's going to be up to $4,300 a month. So it averaged just over $3,000 over the course of time that they're in retirement. And then when they reach 93 and supposedly are passing away, they'll still have about $15,000 left in their retirement account. So that $108,000 they need to come up with until they retire over that 32 years, this is how they can do it. $283 a month, $3,396 a year. If the minister sees this and says, that's what I need to do, but I want to wait, and they wait 5 more years, it's going to cost them 49% more to get to that same place. It's going to cost them $136,000. If they wait 10 years, it's going to cost them 170, and they're going to have 22 years left to do it. So there's a high cost of waiting. So that $108,000 is $3,400 a year. And here's how that could happen under our current match program. The minister could put $1,500 away. The local church could match that at 50%. That's $2,200. Then we come in and match that $2,200 at 50% because the church has paid 100% of its budget to us. So that's $3,400 that's going into that minister's account in this example. And remember, the actual amount on average for the ministers that got a match in 24 was almost $5,800. So I'm not even up to that number in this example. So that's a real quick run through. We're going to open it up for any other questions now that Emily will help facilitate for us. Thank you. I know we've gone a little long, but we'll stay as long as there's questions that people have. Thanks for being with us today. And God bless you.